Hey guys, it's Ryan from Red Panda Recording, and I am being joined today remotely by Adrian Morgan from Brooklyn Vinyl Mastering. Adrian, how are we doing today?
Doing great, Ryan.
It's good. We are just finishing up, I believe it's week 4 of quarantining here in New York City, specifically Brooklyn. And Adrian, I know you had a little bit of a harrowing start to this. You were out of the country when the travel restrictions started?
Yeah, I was in Africa, actually, in Morocco, of all places. Africa for the first time, as a matter of fact. Um, and I guess we left knowing that there could be something that happened or whatever. But yeah, we were there, and it very suddenly the government shut down the border with really no warning and no plan. And we got stuck there. Well, luckily, only for a couple of days, 3 extra days than we planned. But the experience trying to get a flight out and in the airport and just the general commotion because of the lack of organization was just on another level. You couldn't even imagine something like this happening in an American airport or a European airport.
Yeah.
It was very it was just unbelievably organized, unnecessarily so. Yeah, we were pretty nervous that we were going to get stuck there for a while. But luckily, actually, thankfully, due to the British embassy, the American embassy was of absolutely no help whatsoever. You hear stories, oh, we're getting them out and things. No, it's not happening. I imagine it's like this in every other country as well. The British, on the other hand, the British embassy was way on top of it. And, they were recommending flights, and we just happened to see one they recommended right on Twitter or somewhere like that. And that's how we got out. We just luckily were able to book. There was no booking flights at the airport or anything. It was just I just can't, I just can't explain the level of chaos. It was truly apocalyptic.
No.
Yeah, not to go on and on about it, but yeah, it was, we were, it was not looking good for a minute, but it's good to be back.
Well, glad you guys made it out and everybody's safe and everyone's doing well in your household.
So far, yeah. Just trying to stay locked down and just, just doing what we're told, I guess. What more can we do?
Right. So what shifts in the your business model have you had to? I know a lot of us are, working on the fly here, but what are some strategies that you've had to take in this sort of new organization that we're all under?
Yeah. Well, I had years ago, I used to work at a major studio and was doing vinyl cutting generally there with half the time that I was there. And a few months before all this happened, I decided that was going to be a good direction again to go because a lot of the clients, I'd say maybe like 80% of the work we're doing here, maybe more, is going to vinyl. People just want it, and that's just the thing. So I'd say maybe 5-6 months ago, I set out to find a lathe of my own to do cutting, which is an extremely difficult thing to acquire nowadays. Extremely difficult. Went through a lot with that, and ended up getting in, and of course getting it here in here, and you can see it behind me here, and just as it's kind of getting everything all calibrated and all that, suddenly we had that plant fire in California that was pretty devastating, I'd say, to just sort of the lacquer master industry for pressing mass production of vinyl. And that was definitely a strategy I had to get back into cutting those masters again. And that's a bit up in the air now in terms of like what's going to happen with that. There is some hope here and there. There's rumors flying all over the place. But a lot of the cutters that are out there doing this for a living are either working on stock that they already had before the fire, or maybe they have a special connection. There is one manufacturing plant in Japan that makes them, but it's just difficult and expensive to acquire. So that happened, and then of course the situation that we're in now. So how does that affect everything? Well, I'm still hopeful. Really, this lathe here is actually optimized for a more short run production, which would be discs cut in real time. And I think as a result of these masters not being readily available anymore, I kind of anticipate a shift into short run production, kind of ramping up. There's some other studios around. They're few and far between. There's one in New Jersey. I know of another guy in Connecticut that's doing it. And it looks like they are quite a few weeks booked, 8 to 10 weeks kind of thing. So I'm not sure if that's an indication that they're getting busier as a result of this or not, but definitely I see it as something that is going to take off fairly quickly, because there's really not a lot of other choice. Plus, I think just a lot of bands out there just want to have a nice physical product to distribute, and let's face it, it just takes a really, really long time to press vinyl, to go through the whole process. I mean, before the fire, we were looking at maybe 6 months or more to get your product pressed. And that's probably on the optimistic side there. But versus this, yes, it's a real-time process. So every disc that's cut has to happen, and however long the disc is. It's down to maybe a month or two or less than that with this process here. So, I see there being definitely an uptick in this business here. So that was a big strategy. But in terms of the mastering work, I also kind of see that as possibly becoming busier as well, because just everybody's inside making records. Nobody's able to tour. People are remotely collaborating with their bandmates and things. I'm doing so myself with one of the bands I'm in. And there's just going to be a lot of records that are being made right now. So haven't seen the beginning of that yet, but I anticipate something that happening soon. Definitely soon. But we were getting a lot of unattended work here. Maybe a little over 50%, 60% or so was remote work. So it's been good with that as well. Actually, but a little bit of the label work is started to drop off a bit. This business, it can be finicky. It kind of goes in waves. It can be extremely busy 1 minute and just dead the next minute. It's kind of feast or famine. So
sure.
I guess that's really nothing I haven't seen or been used to in the past. But we're lucky, and this business is somewhat recession proof, I'd say, because it's a worldwide market, for one, because of the internet. I went through 2008 with this, and expected the worst then, but things were okay because I was getting a lot of work in from Europe and wherever else. So that's one good thing about this, is that we're already quarantined in here as it is. So that's just kind of the nature of the business. We're just inside working on records all day anyway. So we've seen a little bit of change, but not too much. Not too much yet.
Yeah, let's start with the loss at the plant and sort of what that's meant to the industry and any effects that's had in terms of now the way that people are thinking about storing physical media.
Sure, yeah. Well, is it for a number of years, when I first got started in this business, in the vinyl business back in the 90s, there were in the United States, there were two manufacturing companies that manufacture the 14-inch masters. We have one here, actually, just to show here what it is. It's these plates here. These are basically aluminum plates that are sprayed with a extremely flammable lacquer that's then engraved into. And then these are basically used at the pressing plant. These are pressed in a metal alloy opposite, and that opposite is used to actually press the physical units in the pressing plant. But these are the key to mass production of vinyl here. And back in the 90s up to about, I believe, like 2004 or 5, there was only 2 manufacturers in the US that made these discs. And then around that year, one of the manufacturers bought the other one. And so it all consolidated into one manufacturing plant in California, I believe. And people were kind of worried about that then, because the 2 companies existing before that acquisition, it seemed like they would kind of keep each other in check in terms of the quality of these discs. It was pretty common to see like kind of an oscillation of quality between the 2 brands. Like you'd get masters in from one that would be too wet, and you'd have to dry them out for a long time. Versus the other one the other one had some noise problems, but it seemed like they were aware of each other's problems and would kind of scramble to fix the problems. And so you had a little more consistency. But it seemed like when the 2 plants consolidated, when problems arose, they kind of just stayed that way for a little while. But towards the end, before this fire, it seemed like they kind of dialed out a lot of that, and things were going pretty well, actually, in terms of just the quality of these. And it's there's a lot of people speculating, well, can't you just get some nail polish or some kind of basic off-the-shelf chemicals and recreate these? No, these are the formulation of this lacquer is, it's years and years of work that they put into this, and it changed many times. And I'm sure chemicals became unavailable and things like that as time went on. And, there had to be replacements, and thus the whole thing had to be kind of tweaked as time went on. And unfortunately, the fire that happened was basically just a complete disaster. It just completely burned not only the production plant of these discs down, but the storage facility as well. And according to the owner, the formulation of these was also lost. Basically, just the whole thing was lost. There was no loss of life, but just all of the physical product and the machines to manufacture these were just completely devastated. Now, there was a storage facility somewhere in Europe that had some stock. I'm not sure how much was there, but I imagine a lot of that is gone now, as the cutting operations around the world scrambled to get as many as they could. As I mentioned before, there is another manufacturer in Japan that's making these, but they were a much smaller operation than the one that burned down. And they had the clients they were serving, I believe, were mostly in Europe. I could be wrong about that, but they were basically at capacity. They were just not able to take, or maybe if that's still the case, I'm not sure what has changed there. It's difficult to get any information at all about what's really going on right at this moment. But I believe they're just at capacity, and you got to really have some sort of an inside track to find them now. But I think what's resulted is that a lot of the big cutting operations, when I was at Sterling Sound, we had, that's where I was doing the cutting back in the 90s. We had maybe 3 or 4 months stock on reserve at all times. Probably that much, maybe more sometimes, just depending. So I imagine a lot of the cutting places that are running now probably had that much as well. And so, the fire happened in early February, so we're only a few months away from that. So I imagine a lot of those bigger operations are starting to run down on their stock pretty seriously. And that's going to have a trickle-down effect, not only just for the cutters, but for the pressing plants, actually, that depend on these to stay in business. Basically, they're using these as the format. You cannot press from a short run disc, which is made out of a plastic. Now, there is another type of disc. Actually, I have one here. Let me just grab that real fast. Here it is here. This is a similar type of disc. It's an aluminum, I believe some sort of an aluminum alloy that's been coated with a layer of copper, a thin layer of copper. It's called DMM, or direct metal mastering.
Okay.
And there's not really a lot of cutting lathes that were built to cut these discs. I believe it was less than even 30 lathes that were ever created by a company called Neumann. It was essentially the last cutting lathe they made or designed, called the VMS 82, was what cut these. And I believe there are a number of places, mainly in Europe, that have these lathes. Now, I don't know who in the United States has a VMS 82. Not even Sterling has theirs anymore. They got rid of it years ago. But this is also another way to create vinyl masters for pressing. I believe that definitely the pressing process is quite a bit different for pressing from these. These are meant to be plated multiple times. But unfortunately, the layer of copper here is actually a bit thinner than the layer of lacquer on those black discs. So these have a bit of a stigma in the DJing community as being kind of harsh or bright, or a lot of people didn't really. You'll see if you're into looking for records and stuff in the stores, you'll see sometimes the logo, a DMM logo on a release, and there was kind of a stigma against records that had that logo for various reasons. But I'm not so sure about the high end stuff. But I will tell you that since the layer of copper, which is what you're cutting into on this, is thinner on these, you're not going to be able to bury the needle down as deeply, so you won't get quite as much bass on that. That being said, what's on this particular disc is actually hip hop. This was actually cut by my boss back in the mid '90s. We played this back here the other day. You can see it on my Instagram. And the bass actually is quite good. Actually, this is actually playable right on a turn. If you have a turntable that has enough torque to spin this, it really actually sounded pretty good. Still, I've had this thing kicking around my storage for years, 20 years or something like that. So it is possible to get a good sounding bass, but you're not going to be able to get as deep of a cut on these as you will with a regular master, let alone the problem of just finding a lathe that will cut it. As I said, there's less than 30. I'm assuming maybe even less than that, actually. So all that's being said, it's looking like the pressing plants are in a bit of trouble here. Now, that being said, there are a number of players out there that are promising that they have a formulation of Lacquer Master and are going to be releasing it very soon. There's a guy in Switzerland who's saying this. There's a company in Italy that has like a homepage that's promising. Well, the rumor is that they're promising to be in production very soon, but nobody really knows. Yeah. So what we could see really is a big dip in the production. As you may or may not know, a lot of the major labels, if not all the major labels, are I'd say 90 to 95, maybe 100% of their stuff is being released on vinyl. So I think that's going to have an effect on, of course, the cutters. However, the cutters could get into the short run game at least. So maybe there still is an avenue to keep cutting. Certainly the pressing plants. I have heard a rumor of there being some sort of way to plate a plastic short run disc. Here's a short run cut. It's just it's a PVC plastic basically, and it's cool with the typical lacquer discs. You can also cut on 12-inch discs. Those are known as acetates generally, or dub plates. With these, you can only cut on one side at a time because the bottom distorts a bit when it's being held down onto the turntable. But with these short runs, you can cut on both sides, which is really cool. So you can make a real record. And these are, you can get them in different thicknesses, but I like the thicker ones. This is a 2 millimeter thickness here. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty neat. I mean, it's really a pretty durable disc, I got to say. And it'll play unlimited times. With these lacquers, it's a soft material. So after about 20 or 25 plays, the high end will start to degrade on these pretty seriously. and you'll hear a pretty big difference. But with these don't degrade. Actually, these will hold up. But back to what I was saying at the pressing plants, I've heard a rumor. I don't think it's really true that someone has figured out how to actually press from these. So if it gets really bad, perhaps that is a direction that you'll see the pressing plants start to take, is finding a way to press from short run discs like that. But I don't know. That seems a ways off. So I feel like there's going to be a dip. Definitely, in vinyl production, and how that affects the major labels in terms of their product. I think it's going to affect it pretty seriously.
Well, you'd hope with the trend of vinyl sales going up, through the last, whatever, it's 5 years, 10 years, you hope that somebody jumps in there and sees an opportunity to.
That's the way it seems. But as I say, it was a many decades long process to come up with the formulation to make those discs work and sound good. We kind of take it for granted. And there was a lot of trial and error, I would say, even when the stuff, back when I was cutting, and it was maybe like 30% of the blanks were bad. We were not able to cut on those, or we had to dry them for a few more months before they were cuttable. And stuff like that. So there, even when it was dialed in, there was still a lot of problems. And there's also the thing too of just the lathes themselves, which are extremely scarce. The old lathes that are what are being used to produce masters are scarce. There's only, there's probably less than 3,000 total. In the world. At this point in time, all of them are definitely accounted for. There are there's a number here and there that seem to crop up every now and again. But when those do, there's a couple of guys that'll come and restore them and sell them for insane money. I mean, we're talking like $80,000 plus. The only other option is this particular machine behind me, which is it's been around since around 2015, maybe 2014. It's made by a guy in Germany, and it's difficult to acquire. There's a lot to go through. You have to go to Germany, actually in person, and you can find these secondhand, but he won't support you if you buy it secondhand. So you have to go to Germany in person to buy this, and there's still even the stock machine is not good enough to cut masters. There's a lot of upgrades that are needed, and you have to be willing to put a lot of time in. Right. This particular machine is very far from the stock. It's got a much upgraded turntable. It's using a special pitch control motor that's not stock, and a lot of other special amplifier, all sorts of things to make it ready for cutting masters, which is the reason I got it, actually. But it's also be great as a short run machine. So, well, that detail aside, it is extremely difficult to find a lathe. And you think that would be different because of, as you say, a rise in vinyl interest, and it seems like there's more and more sales every year. And well, if there's more sales, there be more machines being made or whatever. There's been a lot of attempts over the years by a number of different players to create a newer lathe. And most all of them have failed, unfortunately. And to this man in Germany's credit, he has not failed and is still creating it. And if you're willing to jump through, to go through the whole process, you can get it, but it's still going to cost you a lot of money and a lot of time. So, sure. With all that in mind, the lacquers themselves may take longer than we hope to get into production, because there's a lot involved in creating them. There really is. So, let's I don't know. I try to remain optimistic.
Yeah. And when you say the formula, that there's a lot of years that went in perfecting that, that's the actual chemical compound that is used to make the product. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. And this I'd imagine just the machining process of the units themselves are actually creating the discs,
Hmm.
the aluminum discs that have to be perfectly round and perfectly flat. Um, and then you have the spraying process of how to spray the lag. There was times when the two manufacturers existed where you'd get some blanks in that just had defects. They just had like kind of bumps or something in there. And when you're cutting these discs, we're talking like, we're tolerances of 1,000th of an inch or less even, it makes a difference. So if you have bumps in the blank, it's just going to mess it up and just be uncuttable. So the spraying process, and then yes, of course, definitely the actual chemicals themselves, which, as we've seen, are in this particular formulation extremely flammable. Extremely flammable. As a matter of fact, I'm taking a big risk just having this one disc in here. I have a couple of these blanks sitting around, and have to take care. They can really, the slightest spark hits them, and we're talking like an explosion that will scare you and will possibly burn your place down.
Wow.
So it's the smell is. I love the smell actually, but it's a very toxic smell. When you're cutting all day, you start to get used to that smell, and it's not good for you. The people that worked in these plants, the people that worked in the pressing plants, the rumor has it that their health is not the best, dealing with these chemicals all the time. So maybe this leads to just a better formulation that's not so toxic. I'm not sure. Hopefully, that could be a good thing, actually, about this whole thing.
So can you talk through the process a little bit of, so if a client comes to you and they're interested in getting some vinyl pressed, just sort of walking through the process, starting with, they may have already had the work mastered, or they might want you to master it as well. And then my understanding is, even if it is mastered, you may have to do some work on it to prepare it for vinyl cutting.
That's pretty much a case-by-case thing. There are a couple of things when the vinyl format is a limited. It has its limits in terms of what the playback needle can actually do. The two main limits. The first one being is elliptical base. Base that when you meter it on like an oscilloscope looks like a round circle. That can be really, that can actually cause the needle to bury too deeply into the blank. And that can cause like skipping. It can also just be, it can distort the stereo image. So on a typical mastering cutting console, we actually had a control called the elliptical equalizer. And what that basically is an equalizer that monos up the signal below 150 hertz. And we can do that with plugins pretty easily now. The number of plugins that are that can deal with just the stereo spread of any given frequency. So that would be one thing, just kind of the bass, the ellipticalness of the bass. And then the next major thing would be just the treble. That one can be kind of that one can be a tough one, actually, because it's even for a pro just to sit back and listen to your master and just say, okay, it's too much treble, or oh, there's too much 12K or something in there. That may not necessarily be the case. Sometimes you might think it sounds good or it's good, even with a lot of experience, and then get to cutting, and then when you test it and play it back, it's just completely distorted. So you're gonna have to dial that back. There's a number of ways to dial it back. In real time, on the old Neumann lathes, we had this great tool called an acceleration limiter, and there's a couple of plugins that sort of do that. There's a piece out there made by GML. It's the dynamic. I have it here in the rig. It's the dynamic gain control, the 2030 or the mixed version, the 8900. Though that is similar to the old acceleration limiter. And that was really neat because it would detect any acceleration in the treble range and only limit when it detected an acceleration that was beyond what the cutting head could handle. And that would thus prevent the distortion in the treble range. So there's, if you're lucky enough to have something like that, that's a great way of dealing with it. Most people in the mix realm aren't going to have that. Or it's just a matter of just dialing back the treble a bit. There's certain instruments when I was cutting really heavily, like cutting R&B a lot, that would always do it. That would always be problematic. The main one particularly was those bell chimes that you hear in R&B. And maybe they didn't even sound all that loud in the mix versus even like the cymbals or the hi-hat or whatever. Those bell chimes, I don't know, we're just building up so much energy up in like the 14 to 16K range. They would almost always trigger the acceleration limiter like heavily when those would come in. So we'd have to either get those turned way down or just completely eliminate them off the master or the mix or whatever. We had a lot of trouble with those. Not to get too specific with all this, but those are the two main areas that you're going to have in terms of the limits of the vinyl format. That's a great thing about the short run format is you can actually play back while you're cutting. With the cutting lacquer or dub plate, as I say, when you drop the needle on that, it starts to degrade. So you're not going to be able to play those back. You're just going to have to go based on experience. But with the short run format, you can play back while you're cutting and hear it distorting. It's easier to dial in.
So you're actually monitoring off the
cut disc as it's being cut.
Yeah, and what are some other sort of misconceptions, I guess, that people have in terms of how to work with vinyl, or you're talking about the specifics of the low end and the high end, but this short run format it's such a niche kind of thing. So do you have to do a lot of sort of explanation of, just kind of bringing clients up to speed as far as this is the process, this is how it works, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do?
So yeah, there is a lot of explaining that because the older clients are used to dub plates. They're used to being able to cut on one side, but with these you can cut on both sides, and they're playback. You can play them back unlimited times. They don't degrade. The drawback of the format is that you're looking. It's the same limits as all these cutting formats have the same limits in terms of the bass and the treble. And I forgot to mention one also very important thing, the length of the side. So the longer you get, the quieter the side has to get. Okay, and then also the sound quality is better on the outside of the disc than it is on the inside of the disc. And that can be important if, in terms of like your track order, you can kind of, you're going to have a little reduced treble on the inside just because of the geometry of the way it works. There's less revolutions permitted on the inside than on the outside. So you're getting a little more noise, stuff like that. So you can be strategic with how you order the tracks on your album. To kind of compensate for that. It's not a huge difference or anything, but you put on a record and kind of notice that. And keep that in mind, actually, that it sounds a little worse on the inside than it does on the outside. So that's something to always, so the length of the side, the fact that we can cut on both sides, is something that I constantly have to explain. And the fact that this is not a short run, is not a mass production process. Right. It's a one-off. So it's like if you have 50 pieces you want, I'm going to have to cut 50 records in real time. So the more pieces ordered, the longer it's going to take. So I fully expect, if this, God forbid, this works out, I'll have a couple more lathes all gang together that I can cut on simultaneously, not just one. There's a number of guys out there that have setups like that. Have two or even three. I've seen there's a guy out in New Jersey, I believe. He's got 5 of them all simultaneously going.
Wow.
So that's the drawback of it. It's a very real-time process. And it's susceptible to just kind of daily. You're cutting on. I didn't mention what you're actually using to cut on these either. With the short run, we're using a diamond stylus, and those can last a pretty long time. There's only, I believe, 2 places making them, one in France and the guy in Germany, and they are resharpenable actually as well. With the Lacquer masters or the dub plates, we're using a sapphire or a ruby stylus. And those were only good up to about 20 sides before they had to be replaced. So you can get quite a few more cuts out of a short run cutting stylus than you can out of the lacquer styluses. That's a really important thing too. So we're always kind of tracking just sort of the performance of the stylus and when it needs to be changed and stuff like that. And it's very finicky. I mean, just even barely touching it is enough to destroy it. So you have to be very, very careful, and they're very expensive to replace. And it's very time consuming to get them resharpened.
And what do you think the ideal release or project would be for an artist or band who wanted to do a short run? Like, what would the ideal situation be for that?
Ideal situation for a short run, in terms of just what they need, or like the music itself, or...
Yeah, would this be like if they wanted to do a special release, or maybe just something they just finished and they wanted to get it out and going on tour? All willing, we'll be doing those sorts of things in the future again.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, right. I know, right? Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly the market. Bands that need something to sell on tour, even labels that just want to check it out. Like have some pre-test pressings. Record companies or mixed guys that just want to, check their mix on vinyl, that kind of thing. It's just a wide variety of things, I think, but probably more bands. I'd say like the majority of the work would be like bands, like just wanting a couple of pieces for a tour, that kind of a thing, or just a couple of pieces just to sell to people here and there, or just have like a special version. Maybe they want to do a Kickstarter or something like that, and they want to have like a special reward as a vinyl or something like that. And as I say, with the typical pressing process, you're waiting a long time. You're waiting like 6 to 8 months. And that's a long time to wait, to get something. So this is your ability to get something in hand faster here is much improved, I'd say. But I'd say that's the market.
And what about artwork in terms of the label on the vinyl itself and a jacket or sleeve?
Yeah, we have a nice printer that can do pretty good work for the labels. So and we've just been going with blank sleeves, but that whole thing might be something we get heavier into if we really decide to kind of take this. If we really start getting into heavier production and that kind of a thing, I think it'll be important to offer more than just kind of blank sleeves there.
Sure. And I'm sure that information will be available on the website as.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to switch gears a second and talk about, you said you do about 50-60% attended work in there. So what's that process like for you in terms of it? Because there is a heavy technical nature to, what you're doing and and you said there's a lot of trial and error. Sometimes you don't know until you are hearing the playback how it's turning out. Like, what's that process like in terms of also, and then having the client there? What's your feeling on that?
There's a lot of guys out there, guys and girls out there that really dislike doing attended sessions for a lot of reasons. But I have never really minded it because I feel like I'm able to just sort of know the person better in person often, and I can get on the same page with them easier, and if I'm heading down the wrong path, we can kind of rectify it definitely sooner than doing it over the internet and, trying to figure it all out there. So I really don't mind doing attended sessions. In terms of how I would separate like a session for like digital release versus vinyl, I think, we just kind of determine like what the project is. If it's going to be vinyl only, I just have to kind of analyze it and maybe do a test cut and just see how we go there. But if it's going to be digital and vinyl, I would do it where I would set up the session for the digital release. We do the attended on that, get that sounding good, and then later, after we're happy with all that, I'd set up the vinyl. If they wanted to be here, that it kind of depends, just depending on the workload, what's in or whatever. But that could be done sort of as a second step, doing the vinyl, the cutting part after the digital, and that's kind of how I've seen what most people really want. They want a digital release, and then if they want vinyl, that would be a separate thing.
Is it possible if somebody came in, booked a day, and they come in the morning with their file, and by the end of the day they're leaving with a playable a test vinyl to take home?
That's definitely possible. Again, there's those limits there that I said. If it's going to be like a long record, that might be. It just depends. It depends also too. I mean, if we're doing a digital release and the mastering end needs a lot of work, might have to make that go into a second day or something like that. Just depending on how much work has to be done. But if it was like a single or something like that, it would be possible to take it home. Definitely.
Yeah. And what's your typical workflow like in terms of, I know everything's case by case and, every day is a different day, but an ideal number of are you doing an album in a day, or do you have a certain number of songs you try to limit it to?
That is pretty highly variable. As many as 2 or 3 albums in a day at the very busiest. But that's pretty rare, really. Really rare, I would say. It really depends. It's a lot of times just hard to anticipate, how much work it's going to take. You might, listen to it somewhere that's not in this room and just be like, that's great. It's going to go quickly. But once we kind of get it under the microscope, turns out there's just going to, there's a lot of things to do. Maybe, there's problems in the stereo field, or, there's elements that want to distort really easily, or you name it, so it kind of depends. Those elements will definitely dictate how much can be done in a day. I don't know. I imagine I work a little slower than a lot of others. There are some out there that are really dedicated to just doing as much as possible, and billing huge amounts, and that's great and everything. But I'm a musician at my core, and I've been through the whole process and through mixing and tracking and playing and I grew up as a band guy. I'm originally a trombone player, so I've been through the discipline of practicing a very difficult instrument and going through all the phases with that and stuff like that. So, I like to take my time. I like to, have kind of like a bell curve process. I think you'll find this in the mixing world as well. The quality of your output is like a bell curve. As your ears kind of wear out over the day, you get to a point where you just don't know what you're hearing anymore. You're just worn out. And so sometimes it just takes having to come back to it the next day with fresh ears to kind of get another perspective and either kind of continue what you did the day before or just start again, and master against what you've already mastered to kind of get it where you feel it should be. So, I like to take that extra time, and that maybe makes me a little slower, especially as I'm only one person, but that's just how I am with it. For better or for worse, I guess.
Yeah. And I want to go back to that. You were saying as you came up as a band guy, and then in the 90s, you were working at Sterling. And how was it that you found yourself specifically doing the vinyl cutting at Sterling?
Totally blind luck. Just completely out of nowhere. I got the job through just a extremely lucky break. Was working a bunch of lousy jobs and decided, hey, I went to school for engineering in Berkeley, Boston, Massachusetts, and I had this degree, and I'm like, well, what am I sitting here wasting my time for in the finance world? When I should be working in studios. So I just went and faxed my resume to every studio I could find, no matter where I heard of it, and I just got lucky. I sent a resume to Sterling, and the guy was like right there at the fax machine when it spit out, and he gave me a call like literally the second I sent it. It was like, hey, yeah, we're looking for somebody right this minute. Can you come in tomorrow? And when I first came in there, I had no idea what Sterling sound was. I thought it was a mix studio.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even really know what mastering was, even though I had been to school for it. We didn't have any mastering courses at that time at Berkeley. I'd heard of it, but I didn't really think it was a profession or anything like that. So I did the interview and then went up there the first day on the job and went into one of the rooms. And I'd heard all this that the guy was telling me, the interviewer was telling me, we got the greatest engineers here and all this, so I'm thinking like, wow, it's going to be like Bob Clearmountain and the biggest, some big guys and some big rooms, big boards, big SSLs, whatever. And I walk into one of these rooms and it's like a small console and there's a lathe on the wall. I'm like, what? Yeah, well, that's weird. I didn't realize the biggest guys were using such scaled down setups or whatever. And it took me a couple of days to realize where I even was. I strangely joined up with the company just at a time when the engineers who had been working there for some time had just all banded together and decided to buy the company from the founder for a lot of different reasons. And in that process, they went and fired a lot of the staff there. And since I had just gotten on the job and was hired by some of those front office staff, I thought for sure I was done. And I'll never forget the day that Murad Akhtar came in and actually was like, hey, okay, so you're not fired, but we were having this guy come in. He's going to restore one of our old lathes, and you're going to work in that room over there, and you're going to cut all the vinyl output. Because Tom Coyne, the big engineers there at that time, who was doing most of the cutting, he doesn't have time for it anymore. He just can't do it. And I was like, sure, great, and so that was the next couple of years. I just was in this room cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting all day long, and all night long. I think at the peak we were cutting. At the peak I cut 22 sides in one day, and these long sides too. Like at 20 minutes for 22 sides at 20 minutes. That's a lot of sides, and you lose a couple. When you're cutting, it's common for you go. With a long side, it's easy to go over and have to do it again, and stuff like that. So it was we were really busy, and it was very stressful. It's very stressful. But eventually, I couldn't handle it anymore, and they hired another guy to start cutting there, who was working at True Tone actually before that. An excellent gentleman, an old gentleman by the name of Ray Janos. I don't know where Ray is now, but he was really, really talented, excellent cutter. And they got him on, they restored another lathe there and had him start to cut there daily. And I got into doing editing and production there for Tom at that point. Just thrown in the room basically, and like editing for big hip hop records. It was just so sudden, completely out of nowhere. That's kind of how I got my start in actual mastering from that process.
And then from that point, you decided, was it around year 2000, you decided to start your own shop and you started Timeless?
Well, there was a middle point. Actually, there was a trend in around that time. You see, when the CD format came out, a lot of the mastering studios were slow to adopt it because they just didn't think it was going to be anything. And there had been a number of competing formats that were out, and they just weren't sure what to do. And it just ended up that the guys that adopted it early enough made a lot of money at it. And so when the DVD format came around, or was starting to become popular around that time, all the major studios were like, we're not going to miss out on this opportunity this time. We're going to get our own operation, and we're going to start producing DVDs as well. So that's what Sterling did. And they hired a guy that was at another place in Lower Manhattan and to run it and everything. And that was the big deal at that time. I'm a very technical person. And for me, it just, kind of being on the front lines, being blamed for, everything going wrong. When you're a low guy on the totem pole at a major studio, it's a very stressful job. It's, the slightest thing goes wrong, everybody's head is turning to you, like, what did you do? You know what I mean? I was getting pretty tired of that. I wanted to be part of something new and cutting edge. And so I went down, I approached the guys they hired, and they were like, yeah, great. We need somebody to do surround audio and stuff. So I got into doing DVD for a while for Sterling. And we were doing some cool projects, and really, I think to this day, still pretty groundbreaking DVD projects that really pushed the limits of the format. And I was doing surround audio mainly, but then a couple of the guys trained me how to actually program DVDs, and that whole thing, I got into that. And so when I eventually left, I saw that my first freelance business was as a freelance DVD programmer. For just all of the menu structures, all that kind of stuff, and also doing audio and stuff like that. And that was a pretty good job for a while. Strangely, it's hard to imagine that now. But around 2005 or 6, I mean, the bottom just dropped right out of that. But already at that time, I had acquired a lot of analog equipment and stuff like that, and was already knowing that it was kind of going to end. And just thinking that, I need to get back into the mastering thing because, I was at Sterling and people knew it. And I was even doing a bunch of sessions in my bedroom, funny enough. I'm not sure why people wanted to come over to my bedroom and do mastering sessions, but I guess it was because I had been at Sterling and all that. So I was starting to get some work, particularly international work. And that's how I kind of transitioned back into full-time mastering at that time. And I'm glad I did, because the DVD thing just completely disappeared.
Yeah.
Out of nowhere, just gone, overnight, so that was the transition. Right.
And when you started Timeless Mastering, were you doing any vinyl cutting then, or was that more just CD?
I wasn't. Yeah. I mean, it's, as I said, it's a very expensive and a very time consuming and thing to find a lathe. I didn't know anybody at major studios, or at least that would let me go in and cut there anymore. So I just started it up as mastering only, just digital mastering. It was around the time when a lot of the online mastering guys started coming around all over. I kind of joined up with what they were doing, and I was just lucky, really. Yeah, I had a number of people. I had friends of mine were from some international places: Denmark, France, Great Britain. And there was a lot of demand for mastering in New York from those places at that time. So I was getting work in. And that's kind of just how I got started, really. And I got to a point where I was like, all right, I gotta name this studio something and all that. And that's when I started getting into actually building studios, transitioning out of the bedroom and getting into, a real room to work in.
Yeah. And then that brings us to the current space you're in. That was quite the build out that some of us have seen. I think on your Instagram, you can actually see the sort of evolution of the space. But what was that like?
The most difficult, harrowing project of my entire life, by far. This is the 5th studio that I've built. I've just been kicked around the New York real estate scene that long. And I learned a lot of hard lessons on the previous builds, particularly when it comes to materials, how to price that out. I was always buying too much or too little before. And, in the previous builds that I had done. And that can really get you into a lot of financial trouble. You just end up spending money on things you just don't need. So this time I got really into the architecture of this. And so I learned an architectural program, and we just started looking around for spaces and found this space, which was it was formerly a bunch of machine shops on this floor, kind of in bad disrepair. This building was formerly the third ward, like an art space that a lot of people have heard of.
Sure.
And that had kind of folded a year or two before, and they were transitioning the building to kind of a renovation state. And so they were just about ready to renovate this floor. And I saw that as a perfect opportunity. I mean, it was, when you're walking in this room for the first time, you can see on the Instagram, I mean, it was pretty run down. A lot of people were shying away, like, oh no, it's going to be too much to build. But just the layout of it, I just saw as perfect. So I got the measurements and just started doing a whole ton of architectural work, and just had it all laid out all the way down to the last nail. And I am so glad I did that because this is a large build, extremely difficult build out. This 9-foot ceilings, a lot of extremely heavy. It's a wood stick frame. Mm-hmm. This room. It's got a sloping ceiling in the front with special suspension. It's a floating floor, which is actually much higher than my previous studios. About 10 inches. Actually, this floor had to be raised because the original floor in the building is a wood floor. So the downstairs, there's a lot of transmission that can go through. Man, I can just go on and on, but it's a really big project, and we were lucky here, actually, right here in this area. It's an industrial zone, mm-hmm. and we have a lot of suppliers here for building, just up the street, actually. And I spent a lot of time just pricing out materials from different places, and that's where I really had failed in the previous builds. Just going with one place and great, and you can really end up losing a lot of money that way. The reality is that if you're trying to build something like this, which, I mean, if you hire somebody to do this in New York City, you're looking at like $400 a square foot easily for a room like this, for labor and the supplies and all that. I already knew I was not going to be able to afford that, So the supplies thing was a big deal. And the reality of it is it just turned out to be you just have to find as many suppliers as you can. And some are cheaper with some things and some are not, so you have to buy some things from some and some things from other places. That really was a big improvement over the previous projects I had done. Since I had done the architecture, I knew exactly as many pieces as I needed for everything, not only the wood, but I went with many layers in terms of the ceiling and the walls and all this. I had, in previous builds, I'd used expensive kind of esoteric materials, lead-lined sheetrock and fancy doors and things from Europe and all that stuff. I just didn't think that was all that practical in this, and I wanted to use materials that were, readily available. Because I had seen that those esoteric materials can be okay, but they weren't really worth the price that I paid for them, generally speaking. And if I just layered it up a little bit thicker with readily available materials, I'd get the same result as I did with those. So, keeping in mind just the basic principles of soundproofing and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it was a long project. I did 90%, maybe 95% of the work myself on this project. All of the labor, that includes moving all of the materials and all that. Just moving the materials in here was hard enough. To just tweaking the room in the end and all that. And it was a good year and a half, 2 years, solid work.
Well, the space looks great, and I definitely recommend people head over to the Instagram page and they can see, the before and after. And I think it's quite shocking and a testament to your design and your work. Also, since you do a lot of attended sessions, I assume you took a lot of consideration into making it sort of an inviting space for your clients, since they may be spending a good chunk of the day in there with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'd had much smaller rooms. My previous room before this was, I'd say, about half the size of this, and it was very cramped in there. It was too small of a room for these large speakers and to start with, and there was barely any room for anybody to sit, especially if I had like the whole band wanted to show up or something like that. I could only have 2 people at a time in there and all that. So this time, I really definitely had that in mind as a major thing, to be able to fit at least 3 or 4 people in here if needed. It's rare that I see that many come by. Usually it'll be 1 or 2 still. But yes, that, trying to keep it just minimal, and a lot of space to walk around and that kind of a thing, that was really important in this field. That was definitely a consideration.
Yeah. So if somebody wants to start the conversation with you about working with Brooklyn Vinyl Mastering, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, we just launched the new website, brooklynvinylmastering.com. That's definitely the easiest way to get in touch with me. The email and contact form is there. Also the Instagram, we could take direct messages there. And that's the only social media format I have at the moment. We may expand to others, but I've just found that Instagram is a little easier to maintain. There's a lot. I'm only one person, so it's hard. It's hard to keep up with all the various formats. So Instagram or the website is definitely the best way.
How much lead time should they plan on, or at what stage in the process should they get in touch with you in terms of production schedules and things like that?
Oh, it could be any time. I mean, I see a lot of variety there. Some people that are ready to go. More than not, I'd say people are not ready quite yet. They're mixing with somebody, or they're the mixer themselves, and it's maybe a month or 2 off. So sometimes I'll have stuff booked like 2 or 3 months in advance, kind of thing. Like a last minute booking, in terms of like a quick turnaround, is definitely possible. But it just depends on the workload. I'd say, I couldn't say whether I'd be able to do it at any given time, but I've definitely done a lot of rush jobs as well. Yeah, I mean, I book sessions 5 or 6 months in advance, even, quite a ways in advance.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, Adrian, thanks a lot for being so generous with your time and showing us around the studio. Are there any resources that you would recommend to maybe younger engineers or mixers out there if they want to learn more about the specifics of preparing their work for vinyl? Things online they can check out?
Oh, sure. I wish I had a couple of. I really love YouTube and a lot of channels on YouTube. There are a number of various people talking about that. That stuff that's easy to find. There's one gentleman though recently who's really caught my attention. I think is doing an excellent job on that subject, and just mixing and the technical aspects of what we do, digital audio, you name it. His name is Dan Worrell. I believe he works for the company Fab Filter. Check out the Dan Worrell channel. It's an excellent channel, absolutely excellent. And even if you're a seasoned pro, many years, you'll learn a lot from him. And his format of his videos is very professional. I believe he's a gentleman out of the UK or something. Very professional and really well, really well informed. So that's a really great source. There are a number of books as well that talk about disc mastering. There's one I forget the name of the author. It's probably the most popular one. It's called Basic Disc Mastering. Where to find this book? Yeah, probably eBay, I would imagine. That's a pretty comprehensive source about just all things vinyl and cutting. There's also a book by Alan Blumlein, who was like a well-known audio scientist. You might have heard of him from the Blumlein stereo microphone pattern. That's maybe where he's most famous. But he had a lot of theory regarding disc mastering. And there is a book that he authored. I cannot remember the title of that one, but I would absolutely recommend that one as well. The book by Alan Blumlein.
Okay.
Excellent book.
Great. Well, this has been Ryan from Red Panda Recording with Adrian Morgan from Brooklyn Vinyl Mastering. Please head over to bkvinylmastering.com for more information about them. And all of you, please stay safe out there, and we'll see you all soon. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Ryan.